So, one of the things that I find funny to look at is you see the Brexit campaign saying one thing, and then you say, for example, you see the Brexit campaigners in particular saying that they want less globalisation. But you then have the leaders of the Brexit campaign, like Jacob Rees-Mogg, Boris Johnson, David Davis, Nigel Farage, basically saying they want more. And I've never seen... There's this disconnect that goes on between these people and the people who are pushing that message. And it's bizarre. But there's a really good article in The Guardian by Felicity Lawrence, who is behind the push for a post-Brexit free trade deal with the US. And this sort of sums up what I've been saying, because the byline here is, what we didn't vote for in the EU referendum was a clutch of right-wing think tanks seeking to capture our democracy. And this is exactly what is going on. You had, Rees-Mogg, Davis come out and present a Plan A+, which amounts to a basically giving the US submitting and ripping apart all our regulations and allowing the US full reign to do what they want into our country. And bear in mind, Brexiteers were all about, sovereignty, 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 yet this trade plan idea, the Plan A+, goes against everything a lot of these people campaign for. And as again I say, you have this massive disconnect between what Jacob Rees-Mogg is saying and versus what a lot of the Brexiteers are saying. So, what is it? What is it that hard Brexiteers and Donald Trump want so much in a free trade agreement between Britain and the US? Is that they are adamant only a complete break with the EU could achieve it, while Theresa May's deal scuppers it. The sort of deal that they have held up as the Brexit prize is contained in a blueprint published by a right-wing think tank, the Institute of Economic Affairs, called Plan A+. Last week, it was told to remove Plan A+ from its website by the Charity Commission for breaking rules on political campaigning. Boris Johnson, David Davis and the Hard Brexit European Research Group members Steve Barker and Jacob Rees-Mogg have all lavished praised on this plan. The blueprint is one of a clutch of overlapping efforts to write policy that a nexus of libertarian think tanks of both in the UK and the US that have been busy drawing up since the Brexit referendum. Their starting position is that membership of the EU has stifled prosperity in the UK. They propose a bonfire of tariffs, quotas and anti-competitive rules. They prioritise areas for removing anti-competitive EU regulations included in Plan A are unpicking data protection rules, GDPR, introduced by the EU to ensure that privacy and the allowing of free flow of data across borders, which would let big tech companies use our data or abuse it. The EU regulations require exporters using chemicals to present safety data to the European Commission before obtaining authorization for imports are a burden on businesses, they claim, including the plastic sector. The think tank says, think tank says they should go as well. Likewise, pharmaceutical companies find the requirements on transparency around clinical trials onerous and should be allowed should be allowed longer patents. That is, more expensive drugs for the rest of us. And this is what the EU has been protecting us, doing a lot, by the way. And yet people are suddenly, when you say, well, what has the EU done for us? The rule around the pharmaceutical companies has made drugs cheaper. But now, if you want to do that, you open up to the US, and the US will charge whatever it wants, which will put ungodly amounts of pressure on the NHS. But we've already been through that several times discussing this. Hang on, I've just had an annoying advert pop up. Come on, there it is. Where are we? Plastic sector, likewise, should go. Likewise, pharmaceutical companies. Yep. And that means more expensive drugs for the rest of us. All services and the government procurement should be open to international competition. While these think tanks acknowledge that opening up the NHS might be too controversial, they think it a good idea. And protections designed to avoid workers being exploited or undercut by cheap migrant labour, which, for example, limit the number of hours people can be asked to work or require partly of pay with local, or requires parity of pay with local workers for those posted abroad, should be removed, says Plan A+. Same goes for environmental protections, food standards, and the protectionary principle that the EU favours when assessing risk. The US sees many of these rules as protectionist. Plan A+ explains. It says more than in order to persuade the US to make concessions that would allow the UK services sector greater access to its markets. Britain will have to make concessions on standards the Americans find irksome, especially food. Oh, come on. This is why I shouldn't have done it on my phone. Especially food. Oh, go away, advert. Hang on, let's try this. Oh. This is just awful. Oh, I do apologise for this, but what have we been talking about for the longest time when we've been discussing these trade policies? They want, this is what they want to do, but there they go. So the US sees many of these rules as protectionist, and Plan A+ says that in order to persuade the US to make concessions that would allow the UK's service sector greater access to its markets, Britain will have to make concessions on standards the Americans find irksome, especially in food, agriculture and other goods. The things the US complains about and wants conceded includes limits on pesticides, reduces and hormones disrupting chemicals in food, nutritional labelling and the use of genetically modified organisms, the export of animal byproducts, including some specific risk material for BSE, food additives such as flavourings that the EU has banned because of concerns over hygiene rules including chlorine treatments on poultry and other meats, and animals rearing standards such as those of use of growth promoting chemicals in pork and hormones in beef production. Plan A+ is the most detailed on financial services after Brexit, where it suggests a wide range of deregulatory measures. Suddenly the agenda is not general at all, but very specific indeed. It reads like a special pleading in particular for bank hedge funds and wealth manager interests. Proposals include reducing some of the capital requirements on banking and lifting several controls on asset managers, including the bank surcharge, which claws back some of the huge cost to the taxpayer for bailing out the sector after the 07-08 financial crash, and was introduced to deter banks taking on riskier debts. So once again, they want to go back and get rid of a lot of the financial regulations that were put in after the 08 crash to ensure that banks don't create another crash. So controls on CDFs, that's contracts for difference, a form of algorithmical trading which funds trade on smaller, frictionless in asset prices without ever owning the assets, should be scrapped, as some control on short selling and caps on large fund trade volumes designed to prevent excessive swings in the market, especially in vital commodities. The EU directive on markets in financial instruments is described as burdensome to wealth managers because it requires extensive trading tracking data to be provided to regulators. Although regulation is mostly inimical to free markets, the US will want stronger intellectual property rights and regulation to enforce venture capital. The author of Plan A is a former Washington lobbyist and trade lawyer, Shaka Singram, and this is the second time his reports have fallen foul of the Charity Commission for overtly political activity, which is not permitted when organisations claim charitable status, although altogether, such the think tank, the Legstrom Institute, who was instructed to remove a previous report he'd written in a very similar vein from its website earlier this year. Plan A Plus follows on from the ideal US-UK Free Trade Agreement, a draft legislative agreement drawn up by the US-based Cato Institute and the new UK Initiative for Free Trade, which includes among its supporters Boris Johnson, Michael Gove and Liam Fox, as well as 9 other right-wing think tanks. The think tankers, bar one, belong to the Libertarian Atlas Network, which describes itself as a partnership of connecting free market organisations around the world to the ideas and resources needed to advance the cause of liberty. Their personal overlap, as do their funders, is so far known. Insofar as they are known, most are not revealed. They say their funding does not influence their thinking, but we know enough about their donors to see the plutocratic and corporate interests at work. US billionaires, trusts, big oil, big food, big tobacco, and tax havens are among those identified as givers by The Guardian. This push for ultra-free trade looks like a shock doctrine, the explosion of a crisis to push through highly controversial policies while everyone is too distracted to fight them off. What unites these interests is their apathy towards the EU's ability to rein in their power. Their target is the EU that signs up to climate agreements and is prepared to consider financial transaction tax that is chasing down corporate tax dodgers, challenging monopoly control, and is a threat to tech giants, hedge funds, and wealth managers and fossil fuels barons, especially in the US. In the UK, we have been worried about Russia interference in our elections, that we are in danger of missing the source of money nearer home. This is not what people voted for, or even realised they were being asked to vote for in the referendum. That is the trouble. With shadow political power structures, their true shape and purpose stays hidden while they capture democracy. And I've been warning against this since day one, since it came out that this is what they wanted to do. And here we are now, all this time, and you have, surprise, surprise, lead Brexiteers pushing for extreme demarket regulation that is not going to benefit the general members of the public and people who voted for Brexit in any beneficial way. Brexit is the biggest smokescreen to try and get many of these measures through, because as soon as they get these measures through, it's great for them, but for the 99% rest of us, it's not. And that's one of the biggest plays you've seen in Brexit. All these big people who funded the campaign wanted one reason and one reason alone. They wanted to get out of the EU because they didn't like a lot of these measures, which basically meant they had to pay tax and they had to follow regulations, which basically meant, oh no, this year I might be making at least $10 billion, but if these regulations didn't exist, I could make 15 billion. And these regulations exploit people like you and me, people, normal, average people, who would probably never even come close to making that amount of money in our lifetimes. But that's what all these regulations are designed to do, especially the EU. And I can't bang on enough how the EU, especially the transaction one, which will target massive transactions that a lot of these companies do to avoid tax. So there you go. Yet more Brexit chicanery by the people who brought you Brexit.